The avoidant guards their love like state secrets, treating emotional confession as an act of treason against their carefully constructed fortress of independence. They will show you their love through actions, demonstrate it through loyalty, and prove it through sacrifice. But the actual words, "I love you," remain locked behind psychological barriers so sophisticated that most people die waiting to hear them spoken with genuine vulnerability and authentic emotional presence, rather than casual obligation or strategic manipulation. When the avoidant finally admits their love, it's never during moments of peace, happiness, or relationship stability that would make such confessions feel safe and natural. Instead, these admissions emerge only under specific psychological conditions that strip away their defensive armor and expose the terrified child beneath their adult competence. The timing reveals everything about their attachment wounds, their survival strategies, and the profound terror that accompanies their deepest emotional truths. Understanding when avoidants admit love requires recognizing that these moments are never voluntary surrenders, but involuntary breakdowns of their psychological defense systems under extreme pressure. They don't choose to confess love. They're forced to by circumstances that make their usual emotional management strategies impossible to maintain. The words emerge not from courage, but from desperation, not from growth, but from crisis, not from healing, but from the temporary collapse of the walls they've spent their entire adult lives constructing and maintaining. Most tragically, by the time the avoidant admits their love, it's often too late to repair the damage their emotional withholding has created, too late to rebuild trust that years of distance have destroyed, too late to convince their partner that feelings they've hidden for so long are genuine rather than desperate attempts to prevent inevitable loss through last-minute emotional manipulation. The terror of emotional exposure. The avoidant experiences saying, "I love you," as psychological nakedness, more terrifying than physical vulnerability, where admitting their emotional attachment feels like handing someone a loaded weapon and trusting them not to use it for maximum psychological damage. This terror stems from deep attachment wounds that taught them love equals danger, that emotional exposure leads to rejection or abandonment, and that revealing their true feelings gives others the power to hurt them in ways that casual connections never could. The terror operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the fear that admitting love will fundamentally change the relationship dynamic in ways they cannot control or predict. The avoidant has carefully managed their connections to maintain emotional distance and personal autonomy, and confessing love feels like signing away their freedom to someone who might use their emotional investment against them when conflict arises, or when they grow tired of providing the consistency that genuine love requires. Understanding this terror means recognizing that for the avoidant, emotional exposure represents the ultimate loss of control over their own vulnerability and safety. When they admit love, they can no longer pretend they don't care if the relationship ends, can no longer maintain the illusion that they could walk away without devastation, can no longer protect themselves through emotional detachment if their partner decides to leave or betray their trust. The fear becomes most intense around the irreversible nature of love confessions, as the avoidant cannot take back words that reveal the depth of their emotional investment. Once they admit they love someone, they lose the protection of ambiguity that allows them to minimize their feelings if the relationship becomes threatening or disappointing. The confession creates a permanent record of their vulnerability that they cannot deny or rationalize away. This terror also includes the fear that admitting love will create expectations and obligations they're not prepared to meet, transforming their partner from someone who appreciates their limited emotional availability into someone who demands the kind of consistent emotional presence and reciprocal intimacy that genuine love typically requires. The confession might open floodgates of emotional need that they lack the capacity or willingness to satisfy. The avoidance terror of emotional exposure stems from their belief that love is a zero-sum game, where caring deeply means losing power, where emotional investment creates weakness that others will exploit, where vulnerability inevitably leads to pain that could have been avoided through continued emotional distance and strategic detachment. They've learned to associate love confessions with future suffering rather than current joy. Most significantly, the terror includes fear of their own emotional truth, that admitting love forces them to confront how much they actually need and depend on their partner despite their carefully maintained facade of independence and self-sufficiency. The confession would shatter their self-image as someone who doesn't need anyone, revealing the frightened, attached person beneath their competent adult presentation. The terror becomes paralyzing when the avoidant realizes that love confession might lead to deeper intimacy that would require sustained vulnerability, emotional reciprocity, and the kind of authentic self-revelation they've spent their adult life avoiding. Admitting love opens the door to relationship depths they've never learned to navigate and emotional territories they've deliberately avoided exploring. Understanding this terror explains why avoidants often express love through actions, gifts, or practical support rather than words, finding ways to demonstrate their feelings that don't require the verbal vulnerability that feels too dangerous to risk. They hope their love will be understood and appreciated without ever having to explicitly admit its existence and intensity. The terror ultimately reveals the profound courage required for genuine emotional expression, explaining why avoidant love confessions, when they finally occur, represent moments of extraordinary bravery, where their attachment wounds are temporarily overwhelmed by circumstances that make continued emotional hiding impossible to maintain. When loss becomes imminent and real, the prospect of actual, irreversible loss strips away the avoidant's psychological defenses with surgical precision, forcing them to confront the gap between their performed indifference and their authentic attachment in ways that no amount of relationship stability ever could. When loss transforms from abstract possibility into concrete reality, when their partner is actually leaving, when death threatens someone they love, when circumstances beyond their control threaten to permanently sever connection, the avoidant's carefully constructed emotional walls crumble under the weight of genuine terror. This moment of imminent loss operates as psychological emergency that overrides their usual defensive programming, creating conditions where the pain of losing someone forever exceeds their fear of emotional vulnerability. The prospect of permanent separation makes the risk of confession feel insignificant compared to the guaranteed devastation of losing someone without ever having told them the truth about their feelings and the depth of their attachment. Understanding this dynamic reveals why avoidants often wait until relationships are ending to admit their love, why they confess feelings during breakup conversations rather than during moments of happiness and stability. The imminent loss creates urgency that their defensive system cannot process or manage, forcing honest, emotional expression as a last desperate attempt to prevent the permanent separation they suddenly realize would devastate them more than vulnerability ever could. The reality of loss also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain their usual fantasy that they could walk away from the relationship without significant emotional damage. When faced with actual ending rather than theoretical possibility, they discover that their emotional investment runs far deeper than they allowed themselves to acknowledge, that their attachment is far stronger than their defensive programming suggested, that losing this person would create genuine devastation rather than the manageable disappointment they convinced themselves to expect. Imminent loss forces the avoidant to choose between their emotional safety and their emotional truth, between maintaining their defensive walls and fighting for their most important relationship. In these moments, the fear of losing someone they love overwhelms their fear of being vulnerable, creating the only conditions under which they can access and express their authentic feelings without being paralyzed by attachment terror. The power of imminent loss lies in how it reveals the avoidant's true priorities when forced to choose between emotional protection and emotional connection. The prospect of permanent separation cuts through years of defensive rationalization and strategic emotional distance, exposing the real love that existed beneath their performed indifference and calculated availability. This moment often brings devastating clarity about what they've been withholding and why, forcing them to confront how their defensive strategies have prevented them from experiencing and expressing the very emotions that make relationships meaningful and satisfying. The imminent loss becomes a mirror, reflecting their emotional cowardice and the price both they and their partner have paid for their attachment fears. Most tragically, the confession that emerges from imminent loss often feels manipulative or strategic to the recipient, who has endured months or years of emotional distance and unavailability before hearing love admitted only when departure becomes inevitable. The timing makes the confession feel like emotional blackmail, designed to prevent loss rather than authentic expression of genuine feelings. Understanding this pattern explains why avoidant love confessions during imminent loss often fail to repair relationships or prevent endings, as the words come too late to heal the damage that emotional withholding has created over time. The confession reveals the love that always existed but was never shared when sharing could have built the intimacy and security that would have prevented the loss in the first place. The imminent loss scenario also reveals the cruel irony of avoidant attachment, where their defensive strategies create the very abandonment they're designed to prevent, forcing them to experience their worst fears, while simultaneously making it impossible to prevent those fears from becoming reality through the emotional honesty that could have preserved their most important relationships. The moment their control completely fails. The avoidance confession of love typically emerges when their sophisticated control systems experience complete systemic failure, when their ability to manage outcomes, regulate emotions, and maintain strategic distance collapses under circumstances that exceed their psychological capacity to manipulate or contain. This breakdown moment strips away their illusion of emotional mastery and forces them to confront their authentic feelings when all their usual management strategies prove inadequate to handle the crisis at hand. Control failure manifests when external circumstances become too powerful for their internal regulation systems to process, when their partner's behavior becomes too unpredictable for their strategic responses to influence, when their own emotions become too intense for their suppression techniques to contain. In these moments, the energy required to maintain their defensive facade exceeds their psychological resources, creating temporary system crashes where authentic feelings emerge through the cracks in their armor. Understanding this failure reveals why avoidant love confessions often occur during emotional breakdowns, panic attacks, or moments of complete psychological overwhelm, when their usual competent presentation dissolves under pressure they cannot manage through their typical strategies of distance, deflection, and emotional minimization. The confession emerges not from choice, but from the inability to maintain their defensive programming when their control systems are compromised. The control failure becomes most significant when the avoidant realizes that their strategic emotional management has backfired catastrophically, that their attempts to control relationship outcomes through distance and withholding have created the very problems they were designed to prevent. When they discover that their control strategies are destroying their most important relationship, the failure of their entire psychological approach forces desperate honesty about feelings they've been strategically concealing. This moment often occurs when their partner stops responding to their usual control tactics, when emotional distance fails to maintain their preferred relationship dynamic, when their strategic unavailability backfires by pushing away someone whose love they actually value more than their control. The failure forces them to choose between losing the relationship and abandoning their control strategies through vulnerable confession. The breakdown typically includes the terrifying recognition that they cannot control their partner's response to their confession, cannot guarantee that admitting love will produce the outcomes they desire, cannot manage the vulnerability that honest emotional expression creates. This loss of control over consequences makes the confession feel like psychological freefall, where they must trust someone else with their emotional safety. Most powerfully, control failure often reveals the exhausting amount of energy the avoidant has been investing in emotional management rather than authentic connection. Forcing them to confront how their need for control has prevented them from experiencing the very intimacy they actually crave. The system breakdown becomes a moment of clarity about the cost of their defensive strategies. The failure also eliminates their ability to predict or control their partner's response to their confession, creating the terrifying vulnerability of having revealed their truth without any guarantee of reciprocity, acceptance, or the relationship security they've been trying to protect through their control strategies. They must finally risk the genuine uncertainty that authentic emotional expression always requires. Understanding this control failure explains why avoidant confessions often feel desperate and chaotic rather than planned and strategic, emerging from psychological crisis rather than conscious choice. The breakdown reveals feelings that have been building pressure beneath their control systems, finally erupting when those systems can no longer contain the emotional truth they've been suppressing. The moment of complete control failure often becomes the avoidant's first experience of authentic vulnerability in adult relationships, forcing them to discover whether genuine emotional honesty can create the connection and security they've been trying to achieve through control, manipulation, and strategic emotional distance that ultimately failed to provide the safety and intimacy they actually needed. When someone else threatens their territory, the avoidant's possessive instincts override their emotional defenses when they perceive genuine threats to their relationship territory, suddenly discovering depths of attachment they've spent months or years denying as they confront the reality that someone else might claim what they've been too terrified to publicly acknowledge they want to keep. This territorial response cuts through their intellectual dismissal of jealousy and ownership, revealing primitive attachment drives that their sophisticated psychological defenses cannot suppress when faced with actual competition. The threat typically comes from potential romantic rivals who demonstrate the very emotional availability and vulnerability that the avoidant has been withholding, forcing them to confront how their defensive strategies have created opportunities for others to provide what they've been too frightened to offer. When they witness someone else giving their partner the attention, affection, and emotional presence they've been strategically rationing, their suppressed attachment system activates with surprising intensity. Understanding this territorial response reveals why avoidants often confess love during or immediately after their partner receives attention from someone else, when the abstract possibility of loss becomes concrete threat, requiring immediate action to defend their position. The competitor's presence eliminates their luxury of maintaining emotional ambiguity, forcing them to declare their stake in the relationship, or risk losing it to someone willing to invest more openly. The territorial confession emerges from the avoidant's sudden recognition that their strategic, emotional withholding has made their partner available to others who appreciate what they've been taking for granted. When they see their partner responding positively to someone else's emotional generosity, they realize their control strategy has backfired by making their partner more attractive to competitors, while simultaneously making them appear less committed than they actually are. This moment often triggers the avoidant's first genuine experience of jealousy and possessiveness, emotions they've typically avoided through emotional distance, but cannot suppress when facing actual territorial threats. The jealousy forces them to confront how much they actually value their partner and how devastated they would be to lose them to someone more emotionally available and expressive. The territorial response also reveals the avoidant's unconscious assumption that their partner will remain available indefinitely despite receiving minimal emotional investment, forcing them to confront their entitled belief that others will wait patiently for love they're too frightened to express. The competitor's presence shatters this assumption and creates urgency around emotional expression they've been indefinitely postponing. Most significantly, the territorial threat forces the avoidant to choose between their emotional safety and their relationship security, between maintaining their defensive walls and fighting for their most important connection. When someone else threatens to provide the emotional presence they've been withholding, they must either escalate their own investment or accept losing someone they realize they cannot afford to lose. The confession that emerges from territorial threats often carries possessive undertones that reveal the intensity of attachment the avoidant has been concealing, surprising both partners with the depth of feeling that emerges when their relationship faces genuine external competition. The territorial response bypasses their conscious emotional regulation and accesses their primitive attachment drives. Understanding this dynamic explains why avoidant love confessions often occur when their partner is considering other options or has already begun to emotionally withdraw in response to their unavailability. The threat of actual loss through competition creates conditions where defending their territory becomes more important than protecting their emotional walls. The territorial confession also reveals the tragic irony that the avoidant often possesses the very feelings their partner has been seeking, but only admits them when external pressure forces recognition of what they stand to lose through continued emotional withholding. The competitor serves as catalyst for honesty that should have emerged through natural relationship development rather than crisis response to territorial threats. The vulnerability that follows life crisis. The avoidant's confession of love often emerges in the aftermath of personal crisis that strips away their psychological defenses and forces them to confront their own mortality, fragility, and deep need for human connection that their attachment wounds have taught them to deny. Life crises operate as psychological earthquakes that shake the foundation of their defensive structure, creating temporary openings where authentic emotions can surface before their walls can be rebuilt. These crises typically involve events that exceed their capacity for emotional self-regulation and force them to acknowledge their fundamental dependency on others for support, comfort, and meaning. When illness, death of loved ones, job loss, or other major life disruptions overwhelm their usual coping mechanisms, the avoidant temporarily loses the luxury of emotional distance and discovers they need the very intimacy they've been avoiding through their defensive strategies. Understanding crisis vulnerability reveals why avoidants often confess love during hospital visits, funeral services, or other events that confront them with human fragility and the temporary nature of all relationships. The proximity to loss or mortality creates urgency around emotional expression that their defensive programming cannot override, forcing them to risk vulnerability rather than miss opportunities that may never come again. The vulnerability emerges because crisis strips away their illusion of self-sufficiency and forces them to acknowledge how much they depend on specific people for emotional stability and life meaning. When their usual independence becomes impossible to maintain due to circumstances beyond their control, they discover their authentic attachment needs and the terror of losing people who matter more than they've allowed themselves to admit. Life crisis also eliminates their ability to maintain the fantasy that relationships are optional extras rather than essential components of human well-being, forcing them to confront how much their partner's presence contributes to their sense of safety, identity, and emotional equilibrium. The crisis reveals dependencies they've been denying and attachments they've been minimizing through their defensive emotional distance. The confession during crisis, vulnerability, often carries quality of desperate honesty that emerges when normal social defenses are temporarily suspended by overwhelming circumstances. The avoidant speaks truth they've been hiding not from courage, but from the temporary inability to maintain their usual emotional management strategies when crisis demands all their psychological resources for basic survival. Most significantly, crisis vulnerability creates time-limited windows where the avoidant can access their authentic feelings before their defensive systems recover and rebuild the walls that normally protect them from emotional exposure. These moments of clarity about what truly matters occur when their usual priorities are disrupted by events that put everything into perspective. The vulnerability also includes recognition that their emotional withholding has wasted precious time they could have spent building deeper intimacy with people who matter most to them. Crisis often brings regret about defensive strategies that prevented them from fully experiencing and expressing love while they had the opportunity to build stronger connections. Understanding this pattern explains why avoidant love confessions during crisis often feel both authentic and temporary, emerging from genuine emotional breakthrough that may not survive the return to normal circumstances when their defensive programming reasserts control over their emotional expression. The crisis creates temporary access to feelings that remain true but hidden once their walls are rebuilt. The tragedy of crisis vulnerability lies in how it reveals the love that existed all along, but was concealed by defensive strategies that prevented both partners from experiencing the full depth of their connection until circumstances made emotional hiding impossible to maintain. When they've exhausted all other options, the avoidance confession of love typically represents their final strategic move when every other approach to maintaining the relationship has failed, when their usual tactics of emotional distance, strategic unavailability, and defensive deflection have proven inadequate to prevent the loss they suddenly realize would devastate them more than vulnerability ever could. This last resort confession emerges not from emotional growth, but from the recognition that their defensive strategies have created the very outcome they were designed to prevent. The exhaustion of options occurs when the avoidant realizes their partner has reached the breaking point and will no longer accept the limited emotional investment they've been providing. When their calculated distance is finally pushed away, someone whose presence they value more than their emotional safety, the confession becomes their desperate attempt to salvage a relationship they've nearly destroyed through their own defensive programming and attachment fears. Understanding this pattern reveals why avoidant love confessions often feel manipulative or strategic to recipients who have endured months or years of emotional withholding before hearing declarations of love only when departure becomes inevitable. The timing suggests the confession is designed to prevent loss rather than express authentic feeling, making it difficult for partners to trust the sincerity of emotions revealed only under extreme pressure. The exhaustion typically includes the avoidance recognition that their usual control strategies have backfired catastrophically, that their attempts to maintain power through emotional distance have actually made them powerless to prevent the relationship's deterioration. When they discover that their defensive tactics have created the very abandonment they feared, confession becomes their only remaining tool for relationship preservation. This last resort dynamic often emerges when the avoidant realizes their partner has begun to emotionally withdraw, has started considering other options, or has explicitly communicated that the relationship cannot continue without greater emotional investment. The threat of actual loss forces them to choose between their emotional safety and their relationship security, making vulnerability feel like the lesser of two evils. The confession from exhausted options typically carries quality of desperation that undermines its impact, as partners recognize they're hearing love, admitted not from free choice, but from tactical necessity, when all other approaches have failed to maintain the relationship. The timing makes the declaration feel like emotional manipulation rather than authentic expression. Most tragically, the exhaustion of options often occurs too late to repair the damage that years of emotional withholding have created, when partners have already made peace with the relationship's limitations and begun the psychological process of letting go. The confession reveals feelings that might have saved the relationship if expressed earlier, but cannot overcome the accumulated hurt and disappointment. Understanding this pattern explains why last resort confessions often fail to achieve their intended goal of relationship preservation, as partners have typically reached the point where they need consistent behavioral change rather than desperate verbal declarations to believe their avoidant partner is capable of the emotional intimacy that healthy relationships require. The exhaustion also reveals the tragic irony that the avoidant often possesses the very feelings their partner has been seeking, but admits them only when defensive strategies have made those feelings irrelevant to relationship outcomes. Their attachment wounds create patterns that guarantee they'll confess love when it's too late, rather than when it could have built the intimacy they actually crave. The last resort confession often becomes the avoidant's first recognition of how much damage their defensive strategies have inflicted on their most important relationships, forcing them to confront the cost of their attachment wounds, not just to themselves but to people they love, but have been too terrified to love openly and vulnerably.